before we go ahead with the API planning, let's take a quick look on what the API we are going to be testing will look like. Alright, so basically we are testing here a to-do app, and it's a to-do API, very classic, and we have a CRUD operations. So we have the read here to fetch all of the to-dos, the post here to create a to-do, the patch to actually modify a to-do, and the delete to delete a to-do. For the sake of making this video short, we are going to focus on these first 2 points. So we are going to test the fetch to-dos here, and we are going to test the create of to-do. Now, why did we choose these 2? Basically, the fetch to-dos here will come with a lot of cases that I would like to elaborate on the API test planning. And as you can see here, this to-do endpoint, this get to-do endpoint, has the filter, has the queries. Queries here basically represent query parameters, you know, with whenever we talk about API, when we do stuff like that. Name equals hello. Yeah, basically this is what is known as the query parameters. And you know, in the REST methodology, this is how you add filters to an existing endpoint. So this is what we are having here as query parameters. So in this case, we have filters. So basically, we are going to be having filters like so. Filters, square bracket. No. Yeah. So basically, this is how they are going to look like. This is an example of how, for example, this one will look like whenever being applied. So we are going to have the query parameter like this. We are going to apply the query parameter. But this has to be tested as well to this endpoint. So that is why I took this case scenario, because it's a bit more complex than all of these ones below, which are pretty much basic. All right. Let me undo this. And also, if you want to have more details on all of this, I will leave the link in the description so that you can actually follow it, and I will write the test as well for the ones below, so that if you will want to have a look on them, you should feel free to do so after the video. Alright, so we have this here, and for the create to do, we just have the name. As you can see, we have the body, and it takes only the name as parameter. That being said, I'm not going to take a look at these ones. Like I said, you will look below. Alright, now this being said, we can go down into the API planning, and let's plan how we are going to be testing these 2. Alright, now to write this test, I came up with a method which is basically not conventional, but it's what I use whenever I write my test, because there's not much resources online on how you have to plan these things. So basically, this one I'm showing here is going to help you, and you can use it as a base or as a start, then increment with your own ideas and stuff. But this is what I basically use whenever I have APIs to plan. Most of the things that I know is that a lot of people start writing their projects, mostly in the beginning phase. They write their projects without actually writing tests. So a lot of companies find themselves with a lot of bugs at some point in their company, and they are obliged to write API tests to actually ease the job, because writing unit tests at that point in time is not very feasible, or at least it's not very easy, because there's a lot of code that has already been written. Alright, so let's get a look on how all of this works together. As you can see here, just a quick disclaimer, you should always test for the response code before you test anything. This is like 50% of the test coverage, because whenever you test for the response code, you are basically testing for regression. For example, imagine you developed a feature 2 months ago in your app, then this month, while developing another feature, it broke the other one, but you will not know, because you will not have any test that will show it's broken. But in this case here, as you can see, if you test for error codes on all of your endpoints, whenever something else breaks somewhere, the response code is not going to be 200 again for whatever broke. So you are going to know exactly what broke, and you can fix it right away before the code goes to production. So it's always good to test for the error codes before you test any other things. Alright, this is a quick legend of how we are going to be writing the planification of the test. We are going to be using these square brackets you see here, basically to group our tests. So for example, you can see here we are using the to-do in square bracket here to basically group all the tests concerning the to-do resource. When I say to-do resource, I basically mean anything that concerns a to-do. You know, in an API, you can have a lot of different things, not only to-dos. Maybe you can have users and so on. So you are going to have the users being grouped down, and you are going to add all of the tests concerning the users in that group. All right. So let's go to the next one. Here, for example, you can see we have the angle brackets with the numbers inside. This will represent the status code we are trying to test here. For example, here you can see 200. This will basically means we are actually testing for a response code of 200 if this works the way we want. We have this, the double and. The double and basically means, you can see here, the double and simply means all of the tests inside this group tests can be executed together. For example, we can apply the filter name and the filter completed together. That's why you see we have the combined test at the end. This is usually very good whenever you're doing API testing, to actually have everything combined and tested if they are supposed to be so. On the other hand, we have this one, which is basically the reverse, and you can see here for the sortings. We cannot sort we cannot sort by created at and by updated at the same time. So we cannot do that. That's why we have a combined test that has to fail here. That's the meaning of this. Basically, it means the tests inside this group test cannot be combined. Pretty easy to read, I guess. All right. Now we have the test keyword here, and we have the edge case keyword. You will be using this basically to describe your tests. One thing you should always take into consideration is the edge cases. You should not always just write the tests that are going to be totally fine. You should always identify what are the edge cases of whatever you're trying to test. We are going to discuss more on this below. But here you can see it represents all of the edge cases, and this one is represent whatever has to be tested on the resource. Here we have the variables. This is basically to pass variables or to show variables. It's just for illustration. It doesn't have any special meaning, you know. For example, you can see here we use $name. This $name here simply represents here the name that has been passed here as parameter. So it's just for illustration and for clarity. With this legend, you can actually be reading this properly. I will link this too inside the description of the video, so that if you would like to refer to this, you can actually refer to this and maybe make modifications if you have suggestions. All right. Without any further ado, let's take a look on what we have here. So as first thing, we have to group everything for each resource. And in this case, since we have only the to-do resource, we are going to group all of the to-do tests inside this one. Okay, now in the to-do resource, since we said we are going to test only the get and the create, so we will have here the get, and here we have the post for the creation. And you can see here the status code for the post is 201. All right. Okay. Now for the get request here, we group tests for the query parameters. Like I discussed earlier, the query parameters here represents anything that is being added on the URL to filter more on the API request. And here we have the double and. It means basically all of these tests can be combined together. All right, let's take a look at the first one here. The filters name 200. Now we have this filters name, which is the test we are supposed to do. And we have the 200, which means the code that we need to test is 200. And it must be a string. Basically, the name here must be a string, basically. Now, what are we testing? This is where we are using the test keyword, like I showed you up there in the legend. We test, we verify if all of the to-dos have the same name in their name. Basically verifying that there's this search name inside the name of all the returned to-dos in the response. The edge case here, what can we identify here as edge cases? Edge cases basically are cases that are rare but are possible and may break the API, so you should never be neglected. So we have here very long names. This is what can be identified here as edge cases. You may also arguably add empty names here as parameter, but I think that is going to be ignored by Express or by the API you're using. If it's empty, it's going to be ignored. All right. Here we have the second filter. We have the filters of completed. Basically, if you want to filter all the completed to-dos or the uncompleted to-dos. So here you can pass the response code as 200. Basically, this is the response code that will come at the end of the request. So you will have to first verify this and make sure it's 200 before you proceed to the test here. All right, here what are we testing? We verify all the return to-dos have completed equal completed. Completed here is a variable again, and it's this one, basically for illustration. And now, since we have all of these tests in a double AND test, it means here we will need to have a combined test at the end to make sure that this and this at the same time are being tested together, and it should work with a return code 200. So this is a good case scenario where we are testing all of these together and make sure that they work together, because these ones can work individually, but you did something in your code, but together they cannot work, and it's a problem. All right. Now the second thing we are doing is the sorting. As you can see, it's a group test again with the square brackets, and we have the double or sign here, the double bars if you want, and it represents that this could not be combined. So we have the sort created at 200. So here basically we are making sure that the returned to-dos are sorted by created at ascending or descending. So basically, if you want the most recent to-dos to come first, you will use ascending. No, wait. Yeah, if you want the most recent, you will use desk descending. If you want the oldest, you will use ascending. All right. So what are we testing here? What we want to test is verify the to-dos are returned by created at equal this. Yeah. The same thing goes for the sort here. For the updated at is the same as the created at, but here we are basically using, we want to display what has been modified recently. This can be a good scenario in some apps where you want to display all of the to-dos that have been modified lately up, so that if the user wants to modify them again, it's way more easier. And as you can see here, we have a combined test which is 400. So the combined test here is supposed to fail between two of them. All right, that's it for the test description for the fetch to-dos here. And this is an example, of course. And whenever you will want to design for your own API, you will have to actually investigate what your API takes as parameters and what it takes as the body and so on. So you will have to elaborate it here. As you can see here, this fetch only takes query parameters, but what you may be working on may be taking body parameters and so on. So you will also add a body group test, just like we have here on the post. So now let's talk about this create to do. As you can see here, the create to do should have a response code of 201, which means creation in HTTP status code. What are we testing here? We are testing that the returned to do after creation has the proper name. Of course, the name you're passing in the body should be the proper name you have in the return. All right. And you can see this, all of what we did here, all of this planning actually takes into consideration all of this structure. You can see here the to-do takes a name for creation. So here, the first test, we verify the name is actually the proper name that has been created. The second test, we verify that the created to-do, the created at, is actually the current date, because you don't want to create a to-do and you see the date is tomorrow or yesterday, or you want the date to be today. And also you verify that the updated date is today, because when you create something, its updated date is actually the date it has been created, if nothing else has been done on it. What are we testing again here? We verify the created to-dos has the completed field set to false. So here you verify that by default it's not completed, because if you have true here, there's a problem, except if it's part of your use case, but which I may doubt here. Now, always discuss about the edge cases of each test. So here, what are the edge cases for the creation of the to-do? The edge cases we can identify here is the empty name. So you are going to write a test to verify that if an empty name is being passed to it, it still works and returns a proper status code. You can elaborate more here, but I think this should be enough. Another edge case is a very long name. So you should test a very long name for the to-do and verify that it works as well. You can also use special characters as an edge case here. This is basically all the edge cases I could identify for this test, which is a simple case, but In the case of your own API, when you will be planning it, you should be thinking about each parameter that may be affecting your outcome, and you should not neglect them because it may eventually happen. I had cases where I work on APIs and what I suspect the least to happen actually happens and breaks in production, which is very embarrassing for a programmer. Alright, this is what we could come up as the testing. As I said, I'm going to leave the link in the video description so that you can have more look and share your contributions on this too. Alright, and here, let's talk about the best practices whenever it comes to planning and writing your API test. We can identify here a couple of points. Let's start with the first one. So the first one here is isolating your test. You should always make sure that the environment and the test you are running should be isolated and not being affected by data from another test. This is very important so that you don't have bad results. You don't have a failing test, whereas it's supposed to pass, and you start investigating and wasting time on it. So it's always good to write your test, and they should be running on an isolated environment whereby the test from something else, maybe you were doing the test on the filters or so on, are not affecting the test on the create, whenever you're trying to create a to-do. So you should always make sure that your tests are being isolated. The second thing is clear naming. You should make sure that the naming of your test are very clear. For example, you can see here we have a create to do, very clear. We are not ambiguous here. So make sure the name you write for your test or the description should be very clear and not ambiguous. You should not write something like verify that the created to do is actually similar to the one that has been actually provided. It's very long and it's not clear. Be very clear and concise like so, and be very direct so that anybody reading your test, because one thing you should know is that tests you write are actually also serves as the documentation. Tests, when you write the test like this, it also serves as documentation. So you should make sure they are clear and concise. All right. What else here? The next point is clear naming. Okay, we did clear naming. Edge cases. For the edge cases, like I mentioned earlier and emphasize on it, you should always have the edge cases being tested, because eventually this will happen one day and it's going to embarrass you if you didn't take it into consideration into your API test. You don't want this to break into production whenever your clients are actually using the app or so on. Because it's very funny how clients usually use the app the way we don't think they are going to use it. So it's very easy for a client to go and take 100 characters and put it into the name of a to-do. Except if you have limitations for to-do length. But if you didn't have limitations for to-do length, you should actually verify for edge cases here. Like we mentioned up, you can verify for long length, you can verify for no name provided, and a lot of those things, depending on the case scenario of your API. So definitely one of the best point here. You have to verify the edge cases and test them. Mocking and stubbing. Basically, mocking is very important, especially if your endpoints or your APIs are using external services. You don't want, for example, to be testing something related to the emails and be making an email every time you're testing. It's going to have more cost for you, and it's not going to be very professional to be getting spammed by emails on your account, for example. So what you want to be doing in this case is to mock any external service. For example, here the email service, any email, for example, if you're testing something like registration, you don't want to get an email every time your test runs the registration test. So you are going to be using the mocking here to actually mock any external service like the email, the database. But in this case, since we are doing API testing, we are not going to mock the database. In the next section, I'm going to actually show you how we are going to prepare our database or prepare an eventual database for the testing, so that we don't have results that are not coherent. All right. Then the last point is consistent environment. I think I mentioned it earlier, but a consistent environment is very important, because if you don't have an environment that is stable and doesn't change a lot, then you are going to have inconsistent test results too. So you don't want to be having something failing whereas it's supposed to pass and you have to investigate. So you should make sure that the database you're using is standard, the configurations you have doesn't change much, and a lot of those things doesn't change much. You have a consistent environment and it doesn't change for test by test. every test should be running on the same environment, and the environment should be very standard. Yeah. So that's it. That's what I have here for the best practices. If you have more, leave it in the comments below. And this is what we have. Now, in the next section, we are going to actually prepare the environments for writing the test. So we are going to install the dependencies. In this case, there's not much. We have like Express. No, we don't have Express because we already have an API, but we are going to use supertest and jest to actually write the tests. So supertest is going to be used to make the request to the Express API, and jest is going to be used to actually verify or assert that the response are actually the way we want them. And since we already have the API all planned out here, the testing, then it's going to be pretty much easy to actually attack the next point. So let's get to the next step of the video and see you.